Welcome, everybody. It's great to see such a full house today. Please squeeze in. I'm Tori Holt. I'm the head of the John Sloan Dickey Center here at Dartmouth, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event, the U.S. Confrontation with Venezuela, Possible Outcomes and Implications for Latin America. And we're delighted that this event is hosted with the Davidson Institute for Global Security here at Dartmouth, as well as the Department of Latin America, Latino and Caribbean Studies. I'll briefly introduce the topic and our speaker, but I just want to say this was put together very quickly given current events, and we really do look forward to a discussion with all of you after an initial conversation with the ambassador. So obviously this weekend, President Trump announced that the United States had carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela, resulting in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, who were transported to the United States to face narco-trafficking-related charges. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said Mr. Trump had ordered the operation late on Friday. The mission, Operation Absolute Resolve, took about a little over 2 hours and involved 150 aircraft, and they worked to dismantle Venezuelan air defense and other activities. The administration has framed this in various ways, including part of a campaign against drug trafficking and narco-terrorism, while also talking about aims of regime change and security and control over Venezuela's vast oil resources. They're currently supporting an interim government in Caracas and asserting influence over oil. But all of this is very, very new and in play. And so one of the reasons for tonight's discussion is to understand not just what we're reading in the news, but to understand the context, the history, the long relationship the United States has had with Venezuela, and what that might mean. So before I introduce our expert, who's incredibly capable of helping us understand all this, I just want to also briefly mention that the Trump administration put out a new national security strategy in November. Most people probably have not had a chance to read it, but I thought I would just raise some of the things that are highlighted in there because it does sort of lay out a strategy that relates to what we're seeing right now in the region. So, national security strategy for 2025 puts a priority on homeland security, control over border and immigration systems, resilient national infrastructure in the military, and prioritizes economic strength and capacity, including in the energy sector. And what's striking when you read this, if you've read national security strategy before, it's the first time I can recall that the Western Hemisphere was listed as a top priority on a regional basis. And in that vein, it says the Western Hemisphere remains, this is the goal, that to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains reasonably stable and well-governed enough to prevent and discourage mass migration to the United States. We want a hemisphere whose government cooperates with us against narco-terrorists, cartels, and other transnational criminal organizations. We want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets, and that supports critical supply chains. And we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations. In other words, we will reassert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So I lay that out because I think that will help give us some context that Ambassador DeShazo is very familiar with a lot of these principles and ideas. It can also reflect on what's new and what's perhaps not new in that broad approach. So let me briefly introduce our fantastic colleague here. Ambassador Peter DeShazo, also class of '69 here at Dartmouth, and a PhD in Latin American Studies, is currently a visiting professor of Latin America, Latino and Caribbean Studies. He's a former career diplomat. He's just told me, I think, 27 years serving in the U.S. government under, I think, 3 Republican and 2 Democratic presidents. And almost all of his career was spent in Latin America. I think over 20 years in the region himself, including working in Caracas. He's also served in Middle East, but he also was the Deputy Permanent Rep to the Organization of American States and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. He's also led think tanks, including CSIS, a Center for Strategic International Studies program in this area, and was the Executive Director of LAPSAO, an academic program affiliated with Harvard. He's also taught at Johns Hopkins. So I couldn't think of anyone better to really be able, from both a practical and academic point of view, to give us some context for what we're seeing in the news, give us some understanding of the long-term relationship, and perhaps answer some of the questions that we may have. So, Peter, may I kick it off to you and give us a little sense of how do you see what's happening now in the history of U.S. and Venezuelan relations, and give us some perspective on what's going on.
It would have been really hard to imagine years back that we would be at a point like this. Venezuela and the United States have had a very close history a very mutually beneficial history for a long time. Venezuela being not just an important source of oil and trade partner of the United States, but also for many years a democracy in the Western Hemisphere when democracies were few and far between during the Cold War. It's a country with which there's a close ties of people, of exchanges culturally. That relationship has slowly but inexorably deteriorated over the past 25 years. It's important to remember that the regime that is currently in power, I guess if you want to call it that, has been around since 1999, a Chavista regime. During that period of time, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela deteriorated on a step-by-step basis as the Venezuelan regime became increasingly autocratic, as it undermined step by step the institutions of democracy, the judiciary, the free press, took over an increasingly larger share of the economy under state control, and where Hugo Chavez's foreign policy was aimed at supplanting the influence of the United States in Latin America through a series of programs that he carried out, stronger relations with Russia, a closer relationship with China, even Iran. After Chavez's death in 2013, this process was, if anything, accelerated. At one point, Chavez had expelled the U.S. ambassador. Formal diplomatic relations were finally broken in 2019 as the Venezuelan government, one, became mired in perhaps the deepest economic crisis that just about any state in Latin America has ever suffered between 2013 and 2019, and had been accused, members of the administration over the years, of drug trafficking, human rights violations, widespread corruption. Venezuela in the past 25 years has been practically at rock bottom in terms of corruption perception in the whole world, and the relationship sort of during the first Trump administration reached a point where the ultimate sanctions seemed to be in place, and that was basically cutting off Venezuelan oil from the United States. This should have, and many expected it would be, almost a death blow for the Maduro administration.
And why were sanctions placed at that time?
The sanctions were placed. There had been an increase in different sanctions against individuals. This was as a result of again another election in 2018 in which the regime had claimed victory over an election where international observers said that there was fraud, and the government had actually lost, where the Venezuelan government had ignored and sidetracked a legislative assembly that had been elected, and basically they were disempowered by the Maduro regime, and so these sanctions were put in place that really seemed to be the sort of final step.
But was it related to the election?
It was related to the election and to the overall deterioration in the relationship. At that point, Venezuela's oil production had fallen precipitously from what it had been at its peak in the 1990s. The United States really didn't need that Venezuelan oil anymore, but for Venezuela, it was a very serious step. The regime clearly didn't go away. The great success of the Chavez-Maduro regime has been basically to maintain itself in power. It's been a disaster economically. It's an authoritarian regime that has trampled on the rights of Venezuelan citizens. It's violated human rights. It's a regime that is engaged in all kinds of corruption, drug trafficking, but it's maintained itself in power remarkably through this period of crisis. So now in the second Trump administration, very quickly, we saw the pace of sanctions against Venezuela picking up, and finally the assignment of the largest military force probably that we've seen in the Caribbean, perhaps ever, deployed against Venezuela, and finally the removal of Nicolás Maduro last Saturday in that dramatic strike. So this has been a long process. It's not something that's happened just over a short period of time, but the process has been greatly accelerated in the past 7 or 8 months.
So this is the relationship with the U.S. had been deteriorating, you said, ever since the end of democracy there, 27 years ago. But this still strikes you as a dramatic moment. Can you talk a bit more about what kind of governance we're seeing right now in Venezuela? There's been a vice president has now stepped up to lead the country. Is that correct?
Right.
Tell us a bit about maybe who's still there.
Sure. The purpose of the U.S. pressure was not entirely clear on the step-by-step basis. That the Trump administration had cited the drug trafficking. It had stepped up its campaigns to name different groups associated with Venezuela, the Tren de Aragua, and then the Cartel de los Soles, which is really not a cartel at all, but naming them as foreign terrorist organizations, stronger sanctions. It was unclear really what the motive of the United States was. Was it regime change? Was it to try to promote some sort of change within the Venezuelan government? There had been conversations before with Maduro and with other leaders of the Venezuelan government to try to reach some sort of a solution to this impasse. Then it became pretty clear that the goals and objectives were somewhat different, and we can talk about that. The result of what's happened with the removal of Maduro is that basically the Chavista regime is still in place. His vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is the new president sworn in of Venezuela. We don't recognize the legitimacy of her. We didn't recognize the legitimacy of Nicolás Maduro. But in de facto, she is governing the country. And we are dealing with her. There has been, in effect, a decapitation of the regime, but no real regime change as yet. What seems to be clearer now is that the intention of the United States is to deal with this new de facto government that's still in power, the same regime with a new leader, to extract different changes in the way that the regime is governing. Probably the United States will insist on changes in enforcement of counter-drug activities to try to clamp down on counter-drug activities out of Venezuela. It is clearly looking to play a role in the Venezuelan oil industry, and we can talk more about oil, and we should, because that's a central factor in Venezuela. It's always a central factor in Venezuela. And I've taught about Venezuela for many years, and the first lesson about Venezuela is oil and Venezuela are always in the same conversation. There are other demands that the United States may make of a distancing by Venezuela of its relations with Iran, with Russia, with China, and with Cuba. And again, we can talk about that. So it appears that the Trump administration is content for the moment to leave the Rodriguez administration, the Chavista administration, in place, governing the country, but to make demands on it to change its policies in a number of ways that the United States has signaled before as being important to it. So it's not regime change. It's a change at the top. Maduro's gone, but the regime is still in place. So this is the current situation.
Well, thanks for that sort of layout. So you mentioned oil. Maybe we should talk about oil because it seems like it's one of the objectives of the administration to reestablish a relationship with the oil supply and production. And I know you're knowledgeable about the whole history of that. Could you briefly describe what does oil in Venezuela mean? And then what do you think the U.S. is trying to do at this point, given that we are often energy now independent of other countries? And it's sort of an interesting time for us to want to reestablish a relationship with them on oil.
Sure. Oil is everything in Venezuela. Venezuela has long been called a petrostate, a state in which the entire formation of the state is built around oil, the profits from oil, and how those profits are used for political purposes in the country and to underpin the economy of Venezuela. For decades, the vast majority of the vast percentage of government revenue is derived from the oil industry. The United States had a big role in the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, in developing oil in Venezuela, along with Shell Oil. Venezuela nationalized the oil industry in 1976, creating Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., PDVSA. That was a very well-run state oil company. In the 1990s, the U.S. private companies were invited back into Venezuela, the so-called apertura, in which they were allowed under different kinds of contracts with PDVSA to produce oil under certain circumstances. Oil production peaked at about 3.5 million barrels a day in the late 1970s. Following the coming to power of the Chavista regime, Hugo Chavez in 1999, there was conflict with PDVSA, strikes, protests. PDVSA was intervened by the government. The apertura was closed. Most of the foreign oil companies were nationalized, renationalized their operations in Venezuela. And through brutal mishandling of the oil sector, production fell precipitously to a point where in 2020, 21, it had gone down to about 400,000 or 500,000 barrels a day from 3.5 million barrels. This was a catastrophic loss for Venezuela, loss of income. The entire oil sector was deteriorated from lack of investment, and Venezuela dropped off the map as a major world producer. At one point, it had been the largest exporter of oil in the whole world, and it has the largest proven oil reserves of any country in the world, and yet its production is pitifully small. The Chavista destruction of the Venezuelan economy was entirely a self-inflicted wound. So now it's a enormously deteriorated sector, producing maybe 900,000 barrels a month, a fraction of what it produced in its heyday. Experts that I've talked to in the past have calculated that it would take 10 years under perfect conditions to restore oil production in Venezuela to 3.5 million barrels or more. Whether that is still the case, at any rate, it would be a major task to be able to reverse the deterioration in the infrastructure of oil, to produce more oil, to get to the point where the country once was back in the 1970s or 1990s.
So what you're kind of suggesting is that the government may be interested in a deal if it restarts oil exports and production and returns revenues to Venezuela. It's not clear what the deal will be with the United States, but is that where this is heading, or do you see what the interests are from the United States in oil at a time when we have a lot of energy independence ourselves?
Yeah, this is
supply chains, you think, or it's regionally, we want localized sources, or just tell us a bit more, if you can, about the current situation.
Sure, yeah, this is a much debated point. Clearly, at one point, President Trump stopped talking about drugs and he started talking about oil. The oil is ours. The companies were expropriated. Venezuela owes all this money. We're going to take charge of this oil sector, and we're going to work it on behalf of the United States and Venezuela. How exactly that will pan out, who knows? What exactly the mechanisms of all of this would be, what the real interest of the US oil companies is in returning to Venezuela. The oil is there, there's no doubt about it. It's not a question of having to find it, but producing it is another story. How much they're willing to invest in an oil sector, especially in a situation where politically there is yet no clear idea of what the path forward is going to be in Venezuela. But the talk is that the U.S. oil sector will play a big role. The U.S. oil companies will return to Venezuela. They will produce a great deal of oil, and this oil will somehow, the income from it will be somehow shared between the United States and Venezuela. But all of that is as yet unclear.
There's obviously going to be a regional impact on this, but before we go to, say, Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, I know you've thought a bit about a comparison that's often made to Panama, where the U.S. Also had indicted President Noriega and brought him into justice for the U.S. in the U.S. courts. But there's also places where that's not a parallel. Can you tell us a bit more about the example of Panama in comparison to Venezuela today?
Sure. The removal of Noriega in 1989 on charges of drug trafficking and other charges was somewhat similar to the case of Venezuela, but different in other ways. One, Noriega's assembly, his legislative assembly under his control, had declared that the United States and Panama were in a state of war. The Noriega regime had killed a U.S. service person just before the invasion, threatened others. There was a large American community in the area around the Panama Canal, and we had military bases there. There was fear for the American citizens. And the United States went in with overwhelming force and deposed the Noriega regime, and it was real regime change. But what happened in the case of Panama is different from Venezuela. One, the entire regime was taken out. Two, there had been an election that had been overturned by Noriega before the invasion, and the winners in that election were running as candidates against Noriega. They were immediately sworn in as the president and vice presidents of Panama. So a new regime came into place immediately, but it was a regime that had very little experience. Panama had not been a democratic country for 20-some years when the invasion had taken place. The country was ruined by misrule by Noriega. The treasury was bare. Democracy didn't exist. The institutions of government had to build up. The United States came in with an enormous aid package. And we put in place, and I know because I was in Panama for 3 years, pretty close to about a year after the takeover, after Operation Just Cause. So I was there as Panama was reconstructed. We played a big role in building back Panama, building back its institutions, setting up its security apparatus, building up the Panamanian National Police, rekindling the economy, setting up a judicial system. And our aid mission there had a huge impact. It was very, very successful in doing so. So we had a big stake in building Panama back. In the case of Venezuela, Maduro was gone, like Noriega, facing trial in the United States. But the regime is still in place. And we don't know exactly what is going to occur after that. Specifically, I think the Trump administration was very wary of taking control of a country and being responsible for handling it. The idea, maybe from the lesson from Iraq, which all of you know very well, the idea that if you break it, you own it. And we clearly found ourselves in a situation where we were not handling Iraq well at all, and certainly wanted to avoid that.
Even though there are democratic alternatives in Venezuela, they're not seen as viable. Is that the option?
This is another point of comparison. Yes, there was an election in 2024. Yes, the winner of the election were people who were campaigning against the administration, were elected. Apparently, overwhelmingly, all of the electoral observers, international observers who were there for this election said that it was a complete fraud, stolen by Maduro. He had lost by a large margin. He annulled it. Edmundo Gonzalez, the elected president, was obviously not able to take power. Maria Corina Machado, another important leader of the Venezuelan opposition, perhaps the most notable, visible leader, well known in Washington circles, who won the Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize, just recently, is out of the country. But unlike the case of Panama, there is no plan, at least now, to declare them the legitimate rulers of Panama, to bring them back. In fact, they're not in a position to do it anyway, because the government is really is not under U.S. control. It may be under U.S. influence. It may be changing, trying to please the Trump administration, trying to make adjustments to what the Trump administration is going to demand from it, but it's still in place.
All right. I've got one more question, and then I'm going to open up to this audience, and we can have a conversation. Regional impacts. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not this is signaling to other countries a new approach from the United States. And some that come to mind, a discussion about Cuba, for example. Many point out that Colombia is actually the source of a great deal of narco trafficking, and cocaine in particular, and maybe more of a concern than Venezuela on the drug front. Mexico, obviously, is another part of the conversation. Do you have any thoughts on the regional impact of this, or the way those countries are responding to what they're seeing with Venezuela?
Right. Well, and you were referring to this before, Professor, that the 2025 National Security Strategy calls for a so-called a Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine to be applied in Latin America. And of course, the minute you hear that, anyone with a background in Latin America thinks the Roosevelt corollary of 1904, 1905, which basically established that the United States would be the sort of policeman of the hemisphere, that it would use its authority to promote responsible government in the region. At that point, there were issues with whether or not governments were taking on too much debt that they couldn't pay, and whether Europeans would come in and try to take over their port facilities or their customs houses to try to extract taxes to repay their own lenders. That it was a sort of a patriarchal protection of Latin America and a promotion of U.S. business at the same time. And this seems like a return to that kind of a strategy in which the United States is reasserting its hegemony in the Western Hemisphere in a much more militarized way. The language of President Trump about the issue of drug trafficking, organized crime, points to increased military activity, the use of the military in a police function, the militarization of counter-drug strategy in the United States. I'm sorry, in Latin America. So this is the sort of overarching framework that appears to be the case now. Certainly a much larger military presence, something that the hemisphere has not seen from the United States in the past. The Trump administration has stated, and President Trump directly, that the United States would intervene if it saw fit in Mexico militarily to combat drugs if Mexicans weren't going to do it, specifically fentanyl. The United States has said the same thing about Colombia. The U.S.-Colombia relationship, and Colombia is an essential country for the United States. It's been the largest recipient of U.S. aid since about 2000, since the time of Plan Colombia, which was a bipartisan plan to support Colombia in its efforts to roll back a drug-fueled insurgency and organized crime very successfully over a period of time. Colombia had been our key partner in the region, and that relationship has gone downhill very fast during the Trump administration. President Trump and President Gustavo Petro of Colombia have had a war of words over time. Colombia was decertified by the United States in September as non-cooperative on drug counter-drug efforts, which was the first time that's happened since 1997. The United States has cut its aid to Colombia to about a third of what it was before. So that relationship had deteriorated badly under the Trump administration. Although, despite the fact that there had been a war of words between Petro and Trump, they had a phone conversation yesterday that lasted an hour, and President Petro has been invited to come to Washington. And the word is that it was a warm and good conversation. Everybody's smiling. So, you know, it's that one is hard to figure out. Colombia clearly is very important to the United States in so many ways. And of course, it has a border with Venezuela. And of course, some of the biggest coca producing areas in Colombia are along the Venezuelan border. Colombia, unfortunately, in the past 2 or 3 years has reached levels of coca leaf cocaine production higher than at any time in its history. So Colombia is in a position where it's obviously going to be in the view of the United States in a very, very big way. But how that relationship evolves is extremely important for the United States and for Colombia. There are going to be elections in Colombia in May, new president. Cuba, and I'm sorry, this is, I don't mean to go on so long. Cuba I think is definitely going to be on the scope for the United States. I would bet that Secretary Rubio, as events are unfolding in Venezuela, he's thinking about Cuba. Cuba's in a very bad shape. The economy is perhaps the worst it's ever been, worse than even during the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union. And Venezuela, what the oil that Venezuela sends to Colombia and has sent before had been to Cuba, had been very important to Cuba. The amounts have been cut way back. But sort of driving a wedge between the Cuba-Venezuela relationship, I think, is an important U.S. goal. Mexico is the most important country of all. Mexico is our key partner. It's our key neighbor. In my view, the overarching U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere should be and should start with an extraordinarily close and productive relationship with our partners, Mexico and Canada. That is the bulwark of our national interest in the Western Hemisphere. It should be the most important factor. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement that is the cornerstone of that economic relationship is going to be revisited in July. This was scheduled. It looked like it would be sort of a meeting in which people get together, they make a few tweaks maybe, and move on. No, it could be much more consequential. So we have to keep our eye on that. But the relationship between Mexico and the United States in terms of organized crime, drugs, extraordinarily important. And clearly the Trump administration is going to continue to put pressure on Mexico in that regard.
All right, well, thank you so much. All right, I'd love to open this up for some back and forth with folks here in the audience. I do tend to prioritize student hands first. We've got some. I see a gentleman in the back here.
Thank you for the talk. Could you tell us a little bit more about your time actually living in South America, which countries you had lived in, for how long, and what the experience was like? Thank you.
Oh, that was a long time. So it was it'd be a long conversation. I lived in Chile for about 7 years. I lived in Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, Panama. Those were the countries that I was stationed in. Also Israel. They were all different times. About half of the period was during the Cold War. The other half post-Cold War. And lots of different lessons learned. A lot of it had to do, and interestingly, the evolution of the U.S. relationship towards more respect for Latin American agency, more respect for Latin American sovereignty, more desire to work collectively with Latin America, and definitely a much larger push towards, especially after the 1980s, to form a community of democracies in the Western Hemisphere. Perhaps the culmination of that being, and I was there with Colin Powell, Secretary of State, on September 11th, 2001, in Lima, Peru, where all of the countries of the OAS, every country in the hemisphere,
What's the OAS?
Save Cuba, ratified the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which stated right off the bat that the peoples of the Americas have the right to democracy and their governments have the obligation to promote and defend it. That was perhaps the high point of regional solidarity on democracy. It was a long sort of pilgrimage from the military regimes of the 1960s and 70s to this new stage.
Okay, who else would like to come in here? I see a student here and a gentleman here with a scarf. Oops.
Well, could you tell us a little bit about how Russian and Chinese interests in Latin America have changed, if at all, with the with President Trump's capturing of President Maduro?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure, over the very short term. China's interest in Latin America is very different from Russia's and from Iran's. It's much larger, it's much broader, it's much more consequential. And generally, the farther south in Latin America you get, the more substantial the Chinese interest. China is the largest trade partner of some of the big economies in Latin America: Peru, Brazil, Chile. It's a very important trade partner for almost all the countries. China, Latin America's spectacular growth from the 2003 to 2013 and beyond resulted in large part from the extraordinary amplification of demand for Latin American commodities by China, so that Latin America began exporting enormous amounts of everything from soy to copper to oil to iron ore to China for its urbanization, industrialization needs. And China, in return, invested heavily in infrastructure in Latin America, gave large loans to Latin American countries, and became an important player in the economic scene in Latin America, and expanded its political panorama in the region, its political profile, began improving its military to military ties, doing all of the kinds of things that you would expect to see from an emerging world power in an area that it had real interest in developing ties with. China gave a very large loan to Chavez during the 2000s, upward of $40–50 billion, which really sustained the Chavez regime and is being paid, and was mostly paid back, but some of it still remains to be paid back in oil. So China had a big profile. Russia, not nearly as large. Russia's interest in Venezuela came really out of Chavez. Russia sold a good deal of military equipment to Chavez during the 2000s. They still have some of that. For example, 30 Sukhoi 31, I think, Sukhoi 30 fighter jets, very expensive, that Chavez had bought from the Russian bloc. Russia, some interest in the oil area, some investment there, naval maneuvers, but again, pretty limited. Iran's interest in Latin America is sort of as a placeholder, attempting to expand interests where it can. I think it has 11 embassies in the region, but China is really the big player.
All right. I see the gentleman right here with the scarf, and then we'll go over here.
Well, that was substantially what I was after, but let me come down with a small question.
Is that on? Yeah.
And thank you for your presence and also your thoughts.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Since Maduro and his wife were removed, what has happened to smuggling and drug traffic? And I say that for not only Argentina, but to Colombia. What is happening on the ground? And why, if anything has changed?
Well, it's been,
A week.
a week. So, hard to say that anything has changed. Who knows? The Venezuela is a transshipment point for Colombian cocaine. The two paths basically through Venezuela diverge. One goes north through the Caribbean to the United States. The other goes east towards Europe. The estimates of how much drugs go through Venezuela vary. It could be about 10% of Colombian production, 250 tons. It's hard to say. It's real, but it is a very small amount compared to what is being processed and shipped through Colombia itself. Also, Peru and Bolivia are other sources of cocaine, but their cocaine is usually shipped south and then to Europe, Brazil, Argentina, and then on to Europe. The Venezuelan military has been accused of being much involved in drug trafficking. Figures in the Venezuelan military have been indicted in the United States for drug trafficking. They're clearly in a position where they can make changes in that. Again, all of that remains to be seen. But I think that will certainly be one of the demands that the Trump administration is going to put on Delcy Rodriguez.
All right, thanks. I saw a hand over here in the middle with the black shirt, and then also in the back.
Yeah, here.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for coming again. One of my biggest questions is what forces are maintaining the newfound dictator Delcy Rodriguez in power? And if you see any path for the democratically elected president, Edmundo Gonzalez, and the vice president, Maria Corina Machado, if you see any path or possibility for the Venezuelans to have their elected leaders in power, or a timeline, if any.
Thank you. Yeah, the power in Venezuela resides in the Venezuelan armed forces, the security apparatus around it, the key leadership of the basically the Chavista party, and that's about it. That's really the strength of the relationship. Some economic elites, but the military has been involved in a lot of different economic activities, and is deeply encrusted in the system. So the big question then becomes, will there be cracks in the Venezuelan military that can be exploited to somehow bring about more change? Will Delcy Rodriguez be able to maintain control over the Venezuelan military? There are very powerful figures, the Minister of the Interior, Diosdado Cabello, the Minister of Defense, Padrino Lopez. These people they've both been indicted for drug trafficking in the United States. A big question is, to what extent will they exercise key authority? Perhaps, it is believed that Delcy Rodriguez has had conversations with people from the Trump administration. Whether or not there is a plan in place, whether there are expectations in place to move forward in a given direction, we don't know. But that dynamic between her, the more even hardcore elements, and the military, whether or not the military is willing to take steps to do what the Trump administration is clearly going to ask of it or not remains to be seen. As far as the path to democracy and a transition to democracy, that's up in the air right now. I don't see any plan of that, and the word democracy was not on the agenda for in terms of the demands. It's something that I think is going to be dealt with down the road, but in the immediate future, no.
It's interesting because we noted that Elliot Abrams, the former envoy to Venezuela during the first Trump administration, has suggested the Trump administration should call for at least releasing political prisoners and other reforms along those lines. So you see a little public debate from those who otherwise would agree with what's going on. to push them to do more on the democracy side, or the
Right.
human rights side, I should say.
Just before I came in, I read in the New York Times that the Venezuelan government had released some political prisoners and were trumpeting that to world opinion that they're doing that.
All right, thanks. I think we've got Amy in the back, and then the young woman right here.
Hi, thank you so much for your insights. I wanted to ask, so the international laws that many are citing to hold the Trump administration accountable are the same laws that have failed Venezuelan people and allowed the Chavez and Maduro regime to sustain itself and basically, I would say evade international legal mechanisms as a whole. And so I'm curious, what changes do you believe need to be made to the multilateral system to protect countries like Venezuela against authoritarian regimes, while also ensuring that countries like the United States aren't able to abduct world leaders? And so where does that balance come?
That's a tough question. The bringing to bear multilateral international pressure on a regime to respect democratic norms is a tough challenge. Again, we saw that in the case of the OAS with the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The Democratic Charter had some dispositions in it to allow for a country to be separated from the OAS if it did not adhere to certain democratic principles. But generally, it's difficult, especially in the face of an encrusted authoritarian regime, to promote by outside influence a transition to democracy. If there's some sort of an opening that can be taken advantage of, that can happen. There can be all kinds of laws and statutes and agreements signed, but bringing democracy to a well-entrenched authoritarian state is a very difficult task. Look at how long Cuba has existed as a non-democratic state in the Western Hemisphere that has been overwhelmingly democratic, and the different pressures that have been brought to bear and the lack of any meaningful progress in that regard. So democracy is sometimes hard to establish. It's really much easier to undermine, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of constant effort to keep democracy going and to perfect it. And that should be, I believe, a key goal of U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere.
I think the other half of your question, though, was also about other laws regarding intervention. And I think it raises the question, you said in Panama, the Panama legislature had declared war on the United States. But it's sort of a question here is the U.S. in a conflict with Venezuela? Or is this a judicial action of some sort? So, and I'm not answering your question, but I think there's an element there of what he was asking about.
The question about the U.S., the relationship with Congress and Congress's prerogatives and all of that, all of this is being played out as we see. So, stay tuned. I am not an expert on international law, but clearly there are many implications to all this.
All right. I think the young woman right here.
Hi, thank you for this. As a Venezuelan myself, I can't emphasize enough how much I celebrated with my family this past Saturday. And a lot of people here have kind of given me backlash for it, claiming that the U.S. has imperialistic goals almost with Venezuela. And so I've been trying to educate a lot of people and kind of giving them my perspective on this entire situation. And I'm just curious, if you were me, what points do you think I should hit, or how I can kind of find a common ground with people that kind of reject what Trump did this past Saturday, if that makes any sense.
Could I just interrupt for a second?
Sure.
Could you tell us more about what you're celebrating?
My country has been in dictatorship for the past 27 years, and I go there a lot, and I've been through a lot of protests, and I've gone to protest myself in Venezuela, and I live in Miami right now, so I also protest over there. I've seen college students run away from tear gas. I myself have been tear gassed before in Venezuela, and in 2016, 2017, I want to say, I just saw so many people face so much starvation, and it was just so terrible to see how like the Venezuela that my parents grew up in is so different from the Venezuela that I've been exposed to my entire lifetime. And it's just so sad to see how it deteriorated and to see that the person in charge and kind of responsible for what's happened these past couple of years finally be imprisoned and finally take accountability for his actions was just so satisfying. And I live in a neighborhood in Miami that's actually appeared in the New York Times for how much it celebrated, and it was just so overwhelmingly like joyful to be there. And I don't know, it was like I can't express how happy we were that day.
Well, you just did a great job of explaining what your feelings are about why you're pleased to see Maduro facing these charges in the United States. I don't think there's a whole lot of sympathy in many places for Nicolás Maduro. The really key element is what is in store for the Venezuelan people in terms of their well-being, their rights and freedoms. When will Venezuela return to democratic rule? When will the Venezuelan people be able to earn a living in Venezuela, take care of themselves? When will pressure to leave Venezuela come to an end? I think everybody who is, and I've got close ties to Venezuela myself. I think all friends of Venezuela want to see a democratic, prosperous Venezuela. The big question is, how is that going to be achieved, and how long will that take? We'd like to think that it's in the cards, but getting there won't be as easy as wishing it.
All right. I see a hand in the back here, and then a woman here. Yep.
Thank you, Professor. On the topic of drugs, just recently the Trump administration declared fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, making it one of the few self-administered weapons of mass destruction. We've seen how destructive and how violent these efforts to track down drug cartel leaders, for example, with the war on drugs in Mexico, with President Calderon in the early 2000s. Do you sense a need for the U.S. to change its strategy from a supply-focused drug policy to a domestic demand-focused policy?
Really good question. This is a perpetual question for any of us who have served in Latin America, and the issue of drugs has always been on the table in every country that I've ever served in, but especially in Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, Bolivia. Everybody says, yeah, you're coming after supply. What about demand? What's happening in the United States? That's where the drugs are going. That's where they're being used. Clearly, fentanyl is an enormously dangerous drug, and the domestic attention that treatment, prevention, and everything else that fentanyl use should be front and center. Again, I'm not an expert on domestic U.S. drug policy as it stands now, but it seems to me that there has to be an enormous effort in that regard. So demand reduction, I think, is an important component. And it's important for the United States to be able to point to that as it expects sacrifices from people in Latin America, and it expects cooperation and tough measures to try to counter drug supply in Latin America. Again, from my point of view, the drugs are a problem that many multifaceted, but the biggest problem of all is the fact that very powerful drug cartels, and in the case of Colombia, insurgent groups that have enormous resources because of drug trafficking and the sale of drugs and the protection of drugs, are able to compete with legitimate state authority in important parts of Colombia. And until legitimate state authority is enforced in every part of Colombia, there are going to be real difficulties. And it's not just a question of the military. The military in Colombia has an important role in this, but behind all of this has to be an enormous effort at policing, because police are law enforcement, not the military. The police should be doing law enforcement in Latin America and anywhere else. That's their job. But beyond that, in these places in Latin America, there needs to be a state presence that is legitimate. Judges, teachers, health clinics, roads, all of the kinds of things that people need for development and for their lives, those have to be in place. And that is where Colombia needs to really dedicate its effort, and that's where the United States can and I believe should give strong support, and in the past has. So it's, to answer your question, it's really multifaceted. The drug problem is not a question of mere law enforcement. It's not a question of health only. It's not a question of organized crime. It goes beyond into all kinds of different areas.
I think we've got time for one more, and I think there's a woman right here. Okay, and maybe we'll sneak a second student in over there. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. This has been such an enlightening and informative talk that you've provided. I really strongly endorse your endorsement of democracy in the region. It doesn't seem to me that our current president cares about democracy. So I don't think we can expect that kind of a focus from him. He destroyed the USAID, which did have a democracy component, in some places quite effective. My question has to do with whether oil is really the issue. A lot of commentators have said Venezuelan oil is very viscous and difficult to refine, and that some even say that our president is planning to pay oil companies to go and invest there. What about rare minerals, which we know our president is very interested in, and apparently Venezuela has some. What do you see of that as an issue? And then secondly, other commentators have said what's really at play is Cuba, which you mentioned, and that, for example, Greenland is just a distraction, that this operation is really a kind of preparation for what they want to do in Cuba.
All right, thank you. Since it's the last round, I think we saw another hand over here. Yeah, take a second question, Peter, before you jump in.
Sure.
Hang on just one second.
Okay.
I think so. Is it? Yeah, it's on. Thank you for coming. My question was, what role does Venezuela play within OPEC, and then how do you see that changing in the future?
Good question.
Okay,
Yeah.
great questions. Thanks so much.
Okay. All right. Well, on the issue of rare minerals and other key commodities, the Trump administration's national security strategy outlined key commodity chains in Latin America, supply chains, and access to key minerals and key commodities, strategic minerals, as being extremely important, and that's totally understandable. Every country wants that. The big question is, what is the best way to achieve strong commodity chains and to guarantee or to promote access to these key products. The United States really needs, I think, we have a different situation than China in the sense that China has a command economy and it has enormous power over even private corporations that can steer them into developing certain industries. The United States private sector will go in if the conditions are good, if the financing is there, if the funding is there, the markets are there, all of the market conditions that are going to determine whether or not they're going to invest in production and extraction and or some kind of venture to discover and take advantage of these key materials. But yes, one of the key elements is maintaining good bilateral relations with countries to be able to have access to these commodities and then to be able to maintain open and fluid trade with these countries. The United States has free trade agreements with large numbers of Latin American countries. The tariffs that have been put in place recently by the Trump administration back and forth, those are somewhat discouraging to investment in some cases and are disruptive, but in the end, it's the kind of overall relationship you're going to have that's going to strengthen your ability to preserve and to exploit these key commodity chains. But Latin America has enormous resources, very important. The second point was about Cuba. Yeah, the United States, I think, is going to turn its attention on Cuba. How far they push this is hard to say. Cuba is the regime is in bad shape, but the core of the regime, the party, the FAR, the Revolutionary Armed Forces, security apparatus are tight and very much in control, even if there's crumbling around it. It will still be a very difficult regime to displace, and the idea of using force against Cuba would be a tough matter, and hopefully it would not come to that. But Cuba's a perpetual problem. All these years, all these different attempts, and no change. In terms of OPEC, Venezuela was a founding member of OPEC, and typically, Venezuela right now, in terms of its OPEC clout, is very slight. It hardly produces any oil. It's 800,000 barrels a day doesn't sound like very much in OPEC anymore. Generally, Venezuela had been one of the sort of price hawks in OPEC, where it was constantly looking for higher prices for oil because it didn't have the capability of ramping up production very quickly. It couldn't compensate for a drop in prices by expanding production. It didn't have that capability. But again, we'll see what that relationship looks like over time.
And that is probably the right note to end on. We'll see what comes next. But boy, what a treat to hear you give us a much bigger context. Thank you.
Thank you.